Welcome to the Quack and Roll podcast. I am your host, Quack Pui Lan. Today's guest is Dr. Mona West, a biblical scholar and a queer church leader and activist. In this episode, we will talk about queer interpretation of the Bible, as well as the queer community's resistance to right-wing politics. Welcome to the podcast, Mona.
Thank you, Milan. It's really good to be here and to reconnect with you.
I know that you have been very concerned about how the Trump administration's policies have been affecting the LGBTQ community, particularly the trans people. Can you talk about some of the policies that are affecting the queer community?
I think it's a very complicated question because, in my estimation, I think what Trump is doing, especially around targeting transgender people, is an effort to divide the LGBTQ plus community. What's happening is that there are people who call themselves gender critical, which means that they want to cling to male, female, sex binary and see this focus on gender as an ideology and a threat to LGBTQ rights. And so I think what Trump is doing by targeting the trans community is that he's driven a wedge in our community that has divided us. And I think his attacks on the trans community, it's just a step away from then other attacks on the LGBT community in terms of the recension of marriage equality, human rights protection. And I think this is all an effort basically for the Trump administration to create a society that kind of harkens back to patriarchal concepts of family, and that a family is a man and a woman and children, and their whole focus on getting the birth rate up and giving tax cuts for people who have children. So it just feels like that his attack on the LGBTQ plus community is part of a bigger effort to really try to reshape society in this framework of a patriarchal culture that has a very narrow understanding of sex and sexuality and what it means to be a family. And so I really feel like that this is dividing our community, especially around issues of gender. I was reading an article, it was an opinion article in the New York Times, Sullivan, that was published just a few days ago. And he talks about gender and what's happening in the LGBT community around issues of gender is that we've become radicalized around this notion of gender and that we really need to leave gender alone and focus on the rights that we have won in terms of marriage equality and human rights protection in terms of employment. It's a very long and complex article, but I think that's just one example of how this issue is dividing us, and Trump is using it as a wedge.
I have also read the article, and it then fell back to a more, shall we say, gender binary approach.
Yes.
During the early years of the LGBT struggle, there were also people coming out like that. That is, the trans has always been marginalized. And how do you think the queer community needed to organize and resist this kind of gender binary propositions, whether it's by the right-wing politicians and leaders, and also from maybe the lesbian and gay community as well?
On one level, it's a simple answer for me. My first response is we need to claim our heritage as a people who have existed in cultures throughout time, as tricksters and mediators and go-betweens and keepers of beauty, to hearken back to that kind of heritage that we have as healers of society, if you will, as mediators, as go-betweens, and also to build on our history of resistance, that we have a long history of fighting for rights and coming together as a community and working across our differences for the greater good of the whole. And it feels like to me that's really where we need to be spending our energies. I have been reading this book by Judith Butler, Who's Afraid of Gender? And I want to just share one quote from her that I think really speaks to what you were asking about, what the LGBTQ plus community can do, and how, in light of what's happening around really the Trump administration's fascist policies to take our rights away, she's speaking to the LGBTQ plus community. despite our differences, we have to create a struggle across differences that keeps the source of oppression in focus. And I think that's so important. We need to stay focused on the source of oppression, testing our theories about the other by listening and reading, remaining open to having one's traditional suppositions challenged, and finding ways to build alliances that allow our antagonisms not to replicate the destructive cycles we oppose. We cannot oppose discrimination against ourselves only to support it for others. We cannot oppose systemic forms of hatred against one group by allying with those who would intensify that hatred in multiple directions. We cannot censor each other's positions just because we do not want to hear them. It is no time for any of the targets of this movement to be petty and divisive, for to defend gender studies and the importance of gender to any concept of justice, freedom, and equality is to ally with the fight against censorship and fascism. So that was a long quote, but I think she just really summarizes it quite well for me in terms of what we need to be about in the LGBTQ plus community, exposing the sources of oppression in the Trump administration and not letting that administration divide us in these ways.
Now, I want to talk about queer interpretation of the Bible. Mona, you are a pioneer, indeed, of this queer hermeneutics or interpretation of the Bible. I remember years ago when the book Take Back the Word came out, we were all very excited. And of course, later, together with Professor Goss, you co-edited this huge volume, the Queer Bible Commentary. I'm holding the second edition. So can you share with us, how did this begin and your involvement in it?
And thanks for your promotion of the Queer Bible Commentary. It was published a few years ago. I'm very proud of that work that Bob and I did. It really began out of my own journey. I was raised Southern Baptist and was really attracted to biblical studies. I went to a Baptist college and loved my religion courses and decided early on that I wanted to really work in the area of biblical studies. And right about that time, I also realized I was gay, I was lesbian. And this notion of queer biblical hermeneutics and my part in it really comes out of my own struggle to reconcile my sexuality with my spirituality and my love of Scripture. And I think the turning point for me was when I was at an SBL, a Society for Biblical Literature conference. It was a regional conference, and a friend of mine from seminary pointed out the New Interpreter's Bible Commentary. This was back in 1997, so it's been a while. And the whole focus of that commentary series, at least the initial volume, was on looking at this notion of social location as a means by which to interpret Scripture, that a reader's social location, their gender, the way they were raised, the communities that they're a part of, their race, their ethnicity, that all of that plays into who they bring as an interpreter to the biblical text. And so there was a whole list of contributors there, reading the Bible as African Americans, reading the Bible as Asian Americans, reading the Bible as Native Americans. And my friend said to me, there's one group that's missing here, and it was reading the Bible as gay Americans. So I wrote a paper and presented it later at SBL gathering out in California, in San Francisco. And that was later published in the Journal of Theology and Sexuality. And that really just began my career as a queer biblical scholar. I hooked up with Bob Goss after that, and we talked about publishing a book, Take Back the Word, you mentioned, that would really show some examples of what it means to read the Bible as a gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender person. And the importance of that book was and still is, and I think it's also the importance of the Queer Bible Commentary, is that the history of LGBTQ plus readings of biblical text in the early years was always about those clobber passages. What does the Bible say or not say about homosexuality? And we spent a lot of our energy focusing on disarming those texts. And so what Bob and I tried to do in Take Back the Word, and what I've tried to do throughout my career as a queer biblical scholar, is to talk about let's move from that defensive stance of defending ourselves against Scripture to really looking at what does it mean to claim our identity and read Scripture from that place, sometimes in a positive way, looking for themes that are positive and uplifting, examples of same gender love in the Bible, like Ruth and Naomi, Jonathan and David, but also reading in a subversive, questioning way in terms of how does the Bible construct gender or sexuality? And so also have a critical approach. And so that's how it all got started. And I continue to just really be glad for opportunities to write essays or teach classes about queer biblical hermeneutics.
I remember in the beginning, of course, it is to tackle the text of terror and the Sodom of Gomorrah, and also Paul's letter to the Romans. We began to say, gee, what about the Magi? I was just laughing. The Magi, what have they to do with queer biblical hermeneutics? And then when people said that, oh, the Magi may be queer own ways. And I said, well, that makes some sense too. So it is, as you said, not just focusing on the 7 or 8 passages or however you counted them in the Bible, but it's a much broader queer perspective. And that prompted you and Bob to edit this queer Bible commentary.
Yes. And I will say another dimension of the work that I've been doing with regard to queer biblical hermeneutics is to really explore what would it mean for LGBTQ plus people to trust Scripture with their spiritual formation, because there's a whole dimension, at least for people of faith, of reading the Bible for spiritual growth and development and encountering God in that word that has been handed down to us. And so a lot of the work I've done recently is to really look at what does it mean then for us to trust Scripture as queer people of faith with our spiritual formation and allow it to read us in the same way that we read it. And I've had the opportunity to teach a class at Seminary of the Southwest here in Austin, and this past fall in their Master of Spiritual Formation program that is a course on sacred Scripture for ministry and formation. And so it was really a great opportunity to explore that notion of what does it mean for marginalized groups of people, not just queer people, women, African Americans. There have been many historically marginalized groups that have had the Bible used against them. So what does it mean? What are the reading strategies that we can use to reclaim Scripture as a meaningful text, as a text that shapes us spiritually for those of us who want that?
Can you share with us 1 or 2 strategies? How did you teach the students to reclaim that spiritual dimension?
I've built on the work of Elizabeth Schussler-Fiorenza and feminist biblical studies. I think it was Fiorenza who talked about imaginative identification, that you could imagine yourself in the story. She says it stands to reason that if all the people are gathered at the base of Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, it stands to reason that women were there, even though they weren't mentioned. And so it's using that same strategy to say, imagine yourself in the story. You might not be specifically named, but as you said, we could name people like the Magi or eunuchs or Lydia, the seller of purple, but just so use imaginative identification. So that's one strategy. And then social location is another. And I developed this strategy called coming out to the Bible. So I've used the concept of Lectio Divina to talk about reading through a text and just using the text to come out to God about whatever hurt or misgivings you might have about Scripture, but also letting God come out to you through the story. And so we tried that on in my class this past fall, and it was just really helpful for several people who are not gay. They're spiritual directors, and so a lot of folks come to them who have wounds and trauma around the Bible. And so this was a helpful tool that they were going to use in their work with their directees.
I suppose when you started with Better Word, there may be less people you can recruit to write for the book. But now there must be more people engaging in queer interpretation of the Bible. Are there newer approaches or newer voices joining the team of interpreting the Bible from a particular queer perspective?
The circles that I've moved in the last several years have been more church circles than they have been academic circles, but I still keep up with the discipline. And I would say that some of the new dimensions of queer interpretations of the Bible are around issues of trans and intersex biblical interpretation. I think in particular, and these are not new voices, but I think they're voices that are getting louder. Teresa Hornsby and Darren Guest published a book in 2011. It's been a little while ago, but on transgender, intersex biblical interpretation. And so it seems to me that there are more essays and books that are coming out on what it means to read and interpret scripture from a trans perspective. I think about Joy Layden. She's a trans woman. She's Jewish. She's chair of the English department at Stern College at Yeshua University. And she published a book in 2019 called The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah. And Justin Tanis, who is a former MCC clergy person who's on faculty now, I think at United Theological Seminary in the Twin Cities, has done a lot of work in publishing on trans theology and trans biblical study. So I just want to lift up those voices because I think a lot of queer studies in the past have been around, especially the L and the lesbian and the gay, maybe not so much the bi, but I don't think there's been a lot of focus on transgender readings of scripture. And so I think that's really coming to the forefront in queer studies now. The other thing that I would say is there's a global voice that's rising in queer scholarship. And we tried to highlight some of those voices in this second edition of the Queer Bible Commentary. There are people who are Kakai Parmeron, who is in the Philippines, who's on faculty at Union Theological Seminary. And she has done a lot of work in the area of queer theory and queer hermeneutics. And Esther Padua, who's out of Brazil, who's a New Testament scholar. She wrote the essay on Mark in honor of Marcella Alphys Reed, who wrote the essay on Mark in the first edition of the Queer Bible Commentary. Andre Muskoff, who is also in Brazil, is another rising voice, and Margarita Sanchez de Leon from Mexico. So these are all folks who are new voices. We've featured them in the second edition of the Queer Bible Commentary, but I really think that's so important to highlight the global voices as we look at, in intersectional ways, the ways in which queer identities in different parts of the world have important things to say about the nature of Scripture.
I'm glad there are global voices because sometimes some of the conservatives in the global South still say queer or LGBTQ issues are things that affect the Western society and not so much for the global South. But here you have voices who said, no, in fact, these are issues affecting our communities. You have been a clergy and a senior leader in the MCC, Metropolitan Community Church. Can you share a little bit about the development of the MCC community?
I was active clergy in Metropolitan Community Churches for almost 30 years. I retired my active credentials in 2020 at the 29-year mark and served in a variety of positions. I was academic dean of their school back in the early 90s before the internet was developed. And we did courses through fax and correspondence. So it was really interesting and a challenge. But so I would just say that in my early years of MCC, I think one of the major contributions of MCC to the larger world and to the church is that we were there. We were a presence. We weren't going away. And we provided churches and spiritual opportunities and a place for people to respond to their call to ministry as a gay, lesbian, or bisexual or transgender person. So we were adamant about creating a space for that to happen. And I think over time, the world took notice. When I was dean of Samaritan Institute, which was the training school for MCC, there were very few, and this was like in 1992, very few seminaries that were open to LGBTQ plus students. And in my tenure there from 1992 to 97, we were able to broker some partnerships with some more progressive seminaries where our students were allowed to attend the seminary, to enroll in their MDiv programs, and to still receive the support that they needed from MCC through Samaritan Institute around their clergy journey. And Episcopal Divinity School, it was one of those partner institutions. Chicago Theological Seminary was actually the first seminary that signed a partnership with a specific school of religion, was another. And so I think MCC really made a contribution to theological education by these partnerships and allowing queer students to be on campuses and pursue Master of Divinity programs. I think as a denomination over the years, I've seen MCC change. It feels like it's gotten smaller to me and maybe less of a voice at the forefront of queer issues. Some of that has to do with just society has changed. We were born in the 60s on the cusp of the civil rights movement. And with the change in society, and people now in most major denominations are able to be ordained or perform marriages or be married or go to church and be open or pastor congregations in major mainline denominations, I think the activist call of MCC may have diminished some. And as a result, MCC, at least in my opinion, it became more insular in terms of just kind of taking care of its own survival as an institution. Would often hear the question, is there a need for MCC anymore when the larger church, Universal, seems to be open to queer people being ordained and teaching in seminaries and those kinds of things? There's still those places where that's not true in terms of Baptists or Roman Catholics. But even my response has always been that there is still a need for a queer church, that even there are these places for queer people to go and be welcomed in other denominations and in seminaries. There is still the importance of that queer space that has a kind of generativity to it, I think, that you just can't find anywhere else. And so I still think there's a need for MCC, but it feels like to me their focus has shifted over the years and their voice has diminished some in these circles of queer activism. And that's just my opinion.
Mona, you have been a senior pastor in the MCC and other churches for a very long time. Can you talk about what are some of the challenges that women still faced in serving the church, or some of your personal encounters of either prejudice or discriminations?
One thing I will say, I'm grateful that MCC has been a place early on that has affirmed women in ministry. That's not to say that it hasn't had its challenges around issues of sexism and racism, but early on, we had elders and leaders that were women who were elected. There's a story that's told of Freed Smith. She was one of our first senior leaders that was elected, and on the conference floor for the business meeting, went through our bylaws and line by line changed all of the male pronouns to gender neutral pronouns. And that was a historic moment back in the 80s. So I think MCC has always been a place that has affirmed women in ministry. And I think, though, that plays out differently in different congregations. My experience has been that as a female leader of a predominantly male congregation, that there's going to be some kind of sexism that I've had to deal with, or that my leadership style as a woman hasn't been honored in the same way as if I would have acted more a man in that position. And there've certainly been those instances where leadership in specific congregations has been challenged, in my experience, if the congregation is more male. But having said that, I still think MCC has worked hard to affirm women in ministry, and there are still, to my knowledge, women who are pastoring some of our larger congregations right now. And the moderator of MCC, who's kind of like the Pope, but as a woman. And Troy Perry was the first moderator, but then Nancy Wilson was elected as a moderator and served for many years. And Cecilia Eggleston was just reelected. And so I think that's a clear signal that we do value women in leadership. But like I said, I think there can be particular challenges when you go to specific congregations, and especially in different parts of the world, like in the South or in Australia, for example. We have churches in Australia, and most of our churches in Australia are pastored by men. And the one woman that filled an interim position there had some challenges. It can be culture specific as well as congregation specific.
Over the years, I have also heard about the issue of racism in the MCC and, of course, in other denominations. Can you talk about that as well?
I think MCC has worked really hard over the years to deal with issues of racism in our structure. There's still a long way to go, but I'm trying to remember now. People of African Descent is an organization in MCC that has really tried to help highlight and focus on the gifts and the callings of people of African descent. And I've served on several task forces that really looked at our clergy credentialing system and where there was racial bias there and how to remedy that. As I said, MCC has worked really hard and continues to, and there's still more work to be done. I was reading a Facebook post the other day of someone who was lamenting that in this recent election of a new moderator, that the nominating committee could put forth up to 5 candidates. They only put forth 2, and both of them were white. And so I still think there's still that work to be done. But for me, I guess the good news is that we continue to do it and we don't shy away from it, and that MCC has committed resources and staff positions and funding for that work.
What is your advice for younger people who are LGBTQ persons who wants to consider to serve in the church? Would you encourage that, or what would be your advice?
I would encourage them. Some person in every generation will say, this generation is a time of great change. but I'll say it. I think we are in such a period of huge change in the world in terms of just the pandemic that we just came out of, and that we're still not totally over, but that we've just come on the other side of. The global order that's being rearranged right now, it feels like under the Trump administration. And for a while, I think that the church has been in decline or dealing with, I'll just call it birthing pangs, or asking, what does all of this mean? You think about this, the nuns, the spiritual but not religious people. And it just feels this is such a time of great change. And rather than despair and see it as a chaotic time or a time to flee from, there's a great opportunity to make a difference and to provide a voice, to be a truth teller, to be a shape shifter and a shaper as things fall away and a new thing starts to emerge. I'm an Old Testament scholar, and so an image that comes to mind is the period of the exile in Israel's history was such a catastrophic experience in which everything in their world was rearranged. They didn't have a king, they didn't have a temple, they didn't have a land, they just lost it all. And out of the exile, though, that was such a creative and watershed time in Israel's history in terms of what was produced out of it. And it just feels like to me, that's a moment that we're in right now, that this is a watershed moment in the world and also in the church to give birth to something new that's going to make a difference. So I would encourage LGBTQ plus young people to say yes to that call to ministry and be a change agent.
Thank you very much, Mona, for joining the podcast today. Please support Cock and Roll by clicking like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.